Hello everyone, I'm back again with the only pieces I have so far of my tank destroyers and my armored cars. Got a couple Japanese, I got a Japanese armored car and I have a Russian armored car. I know the Russian is a BA-6. I don't really know what the Japanese armored car was. And I have the same problem with the Japanese tank destroyer. I know what the German and the Russian was, but I don't really remember what this guy is. But anyway, Historical Board Gaming does have a rule set for their scout car. They call it an armored car, and it's in, the only reference I could find was it was in the Spanish expansion, and I'll show you the front of that. The Spanish Civil War. I got that expansion. It's one of the first ones I got, and they do talk about the armored car in there. And basically, what they said was the armored car can move to cost 3. Same as an infantry, same as a cavalry, has an attack of 3 and a defense of 2. The only problem I see is that the armored car is the same exact stat line as the cavalry is. So cavalry, which you have your infantry and you mark it with the cavalry symbol, the cavalry is a 3 attack, 2 defense, 2 movement, and cost 3 as well. Only the cavalry has a bonus. It can be upgraded with an artillery piece. Armored car cannot. Not only that, armored car can't blitz. And so this is what I wrote to try to, I guess this is our house rule, and if you like it, you can use it. If you don't like it, you can always, change it a little bit or not use it at all if you don't want to. But this is what I wrote up for the fluff to try to explain my logic behind why the armored car should have this kind of a stat line. Armored cars, reconnaissance units, which is what an armored car really is, were often equipped with armored cars. They are and still are with different weaponry. They are the eyes and the ears for armored divisions. They gather information, locate the best locations for ambushes and avenues of approach, size and numbers of the opponent. And so because of that reason, I think that they really do enhance tank divisions. I mean, that's really what they do currently, and I think that's what they did back then as well. So this is our house rules. This is not Historical Board Gaming's yet. Maybe they like this and they want to implement this, but if they don't, this is just our house rule of these pieces. They still cost 3, they still have an attack of 3 and a defense of 2, and they still cannot blitz, so there's no change there. But if you pair them with a tank during combat, so in other words, it doesn't mess with your movement or your blitzing with pairing with a mechanized, you increase the attack and defense power of that paired unit by +1. So if you pair an armored car with a light tank, a medium tank, or a heavy tank, it will get +1 during the combat phase on attack and +1 on defense until the armored car is destroyed. And again, a tank is defined as light, medium, or heavy, and not these guys you see next to him, the tank destroyers. Because tank destroyers were really not out there being mobile. Most of them were, being used to try to locate tanks and kill them. So that's my house rule for armored cars. So now let's talk about tank destroyers. So before I talk in depth about tank destroyers, let's talk about a little history behind tank destroyers. It is true that tank destroyers, I guess they were designed fairly early on in the war. Germany had the Marder, I think it's the Marder, and they also had another one that was a Panzer I chassis, which they put a bigger gun on to deal with the French or whatever. but they didn't have very many of them. And it wasn't until the Germans really ran into the Russians in 1941, when they ran into the T-34s, that they started to think a little more heavily about tank destroyers. And it became even more of an issue when the Germans looked at their materials. And if you think about it, the cost of making a turret, in the difference of that cost versus just simply mounting a gun on a chassis that you turn the tracks one direction or the other to target in your opponent or whatever your enemy is. And so it had to do with first of all finding out that you needed something, and then second of all the cost. And so that's kind of the two kind of criteria that I went at. So the first thing about these tanks, for the house rules that we're going to use, the tank destroyers, which are all these guys here, and I realize that the Americans have their Hellcats and Jacksons, and so we didn't really follow necessarily that same philosophy. We actually put turrets on ours, but they were still tank destroyers. First, you can't build them prior to January of 1942. So these guys can't be built before January of 1942. The cost is 5. The standard cost is 5, and I'll explain that in a second. They attack at a 4, so they're not great at attacking. They defend at 5, so they're on par with a medium tank on defense. They, however, have target armor 1, which is the same kind of thing that the heavy tanks have. They have target selection 1. In the game of Global 1936, there's a thing called target selection, which I'll explain in a later video, but it basically means that if you happen to roll that number or less, then you, as the roller, instead of the defender, get to pick what the opponent loses. But if it says target selection armor 1, or target selection 1 armor or whatever, that means that you have to choose a tank. You can't choose somebody's plane or whatever. It has to be a tank, or it has to be an armored piece, including the tank destroyer themselves. They cannot be blitz, and they cannot upgrade with an armored car at all. So that's the house rules that we've come up with, and as of right now, I haven't found any rules that pertain directly to tank destroyers in Global 1936. So if there is one out there, please comment and lead me to it, and I might just drop this and go to that. But this as of right now is our house rules for tank destroyers. The other thing is the cost. I said the cost is 5, so that's 1 less than a tank, because I want to make them a touch cheaper than a medium tank. But if you're Italy, you're going to pay +1. And if you're Japan, you're going to pay +2. And you might ask why. Well, that's because in the rules, these two countries, Japan and Italy, their medium tanks cost 8 instead of 6, for example, for Japan. And it's 7 instead of 6 for Italy. So those two countries have a disadvantage for building armor. Now, they have an advantage in other places, so before you think too much, there is a whole cost setup that's different for the ships that Japan can build versus Germany, as an example. But we just made it so that if you want to build a tank destroyer as Japan, it's going to cost you 7 instead of 5. And if you're Italy, it's going to cost you 6 instead of 5. But then their other stuff costs more as well. So anyway, I just wanted to talk about a couple of the house rules that we've got to try to expand our pieces, our piece base, and the diversity in the game. And this is what we're going to do so far. And if you feel that we're being too liberal or too constrained on these pieces, leave comments below. That's just fine. We'll pay attention to everything that everybody has to say. So looking forward to the next video. It'll be on Japan's pieces. And then we'll keep moving through the line, and these are just appetizers for the battle report that's going to be conducted in a week, as I've said, for Historical Board Gaming's Global 1936. Take it easy. Talk to you later.